Ring of Fire. The big one fears Mount after the Guatemala eruption, followed the Kilauea eruption. The Ring of Fire around the Pacific Ocean has more than 450 volcanoes. This is where it is. You can see the yellow dots are the volcanoes. And Hawaii sits in the hotspot right in the middle of this Pacific Ring of Fire. The Cocos Plate is where we had the Guatemala volcano. The Pacific Ring of Fire has 75% of the world's active and dormant volcanoes, and in addition is prone to powerful earthquakes. And this is why. The Ring of Fire is located along a chain of volcanoes and other tectonically active structures surrounding the Pacific Ocean. The chain runs up along the western coast of South and North America, crosses over the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, runs down the eastern coast of Asia, Kamchatka of Russia, Asia, past New Zealand, all the way into the northern coast of Antarctica. The Ring of Fire is one of the most geologically active areas on Earth, and it's the site of frequent earthquakes and powerful volcanic eruptions. And by the way, Antarctica has volcanoes as well. There are more than 450 active and dormant volcanoes in this Ring of Fire. Many of them were created through the tectonic process of subduction, whereby dense ocean plates collide with each other, sliding under lighter continental plates. The material from the ocean floor melts as it enters the Earth's interior, then rises to the nearby surface as magma. Noteworthy volcanoes that dot the Ring of Fire are Mount St. Helens in the US that blew recently, Mount Fuji in Japan, and Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. Since 1850, about 90% of the 16 most powerful volcanic eruptions on Earth have occurred within this Pacific Ring of Fire. Deep ocean trenches are common features of the Ring of Fire. These trenches form along subduction zones where slabs of the ocean floor slide into the Earth. The deepest part of the ocean on the Earth, the Mariana Trench, is located along the Ring of Fire in the western portion of the Pacific Ocean basin. The majority of Earth's earthquakes occur in this Ring of Fire as well. These earthquakes are caused by, again, the sudden lateral or vertical movement of rock along the plates. About 81% of the world's largest earthquakes have occurred along the Ring of Fire. The largest earthquake ever recorded on Earth was the 9.5 magnitude of the Richter scale that struck Chile in May 22, 1960. Other significant earthquakes that occurred along the Ring of Fire include the 9.2 magnitude earthquake that struck Prince William Sound in Alaska, March 28, 1964, and a 9.1 magnitude earthquake that struck off the coast of Sumatra, December 26, 2004, and, of course, the well-known 9.0 earthquake that struck near the coast of Honshu, Japan, and that caused Fukushima on March 11, 2011. Even though we have these high levels of tectonic and seismic activity, millions of people live on this breathtaking landscape of the Ring of Fire. Scientists are now working with government officials to help nations in these regions improve their response time to natural disasters in order to build their resiliency. The bottom line is, the Ring of Fire is a long chain of volcanoes and other tectonically active structures such as ocean trenches and earthquake fault zones surrounding the Pacific Ocean. Approximately 90% of the most powerful volcanic eruptions and 81% of the world's largest earthquakes occurred here. And the Ring of Fire is home to millions of people who are working to improve their resiliency to these natural disasters. Now, the Ring of Fire, big one, fears Mount after the Guatemala eruption, which followed a few days after The Kilauea eruption. That was the headline on the news after Guatemala's Fuego volcano erupted and killing 25 people, injuring hundreds more. Actually, the count is up to over 60 and 300 injured. In May, the paper ran a similar story response to eruption of Hawaii's Kilauea Peak, saying Kilauea volcanic eruption, the big one on its way? Question mark. What was the 1790 explosion? So both of these articles do acknowledge that the scientists are skeptical of the Ring of Fire and the Big One fears. Now what's going on? Does the Ring of Fire have the Ring of Truth? Whenever a volcano erupts or an earthquake hits somewhere around the world, the Pacific Ocean, the Ring of Fire, you'll probably hear reports referring to the Ring of Fire and the Big One, perhaps. Colin McPherson, professor of earth sciences at Durham University in England, explains, quote, "The Ring of Fire is a geographic description of the fact that anywhere you go around the margins of the Pacific Ocean, you find volcanoes. There are some gaps, but mostly there's a chain of volcanoes that runs much of the way where there is land." So does that mean that earthquakes and eruptions around the Pacific edge are linked to one another? Professor McPherson points out that this is where the term Ring of Fire can be misleading. Quote, "The idea that there's a single chain of volcanoes that are somehow linked to one another is not really a concept that people who study volcanoes would adhere to," end quote. Ken Rubin, who is a professor of volcanology at University of Hawaii, says, "For the most part, the eruptions are caused by local factors at that volcano. There are occasions when one large geophysical event like an eruption or an earthquake, have been suspected to set off another large event on another site. While it's easy to prove that events are correlated in time, it's much more difficult to determine if events are actually related. I think it's human nature to look for connections between large events. Addressing our curiosity is really what drives science in the first place." So is it true that the Pacific coast is particularly prone to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, but does that mean that those events are linked to each other? And what about the Big One? After the coverage of the recent eruptions in Guatemala and Hawaii, journalists are talking about the elusive Big One. The idea that there might be a massive volcanic eruption on its way, and the concept does have some basis in truth, but could be misleading. Professor McPherson again says, "Those of us who study volcanoes all expect that there will be a very large volcanic eruption, perhaps in our lifetime, perhaps not. When it comes to predicting when it can happen, it gets much hazier. Just as we don't see the Ring of Fire being a linked series of volcanic events that you can predict, there is not really a concept of being able to predict the Big One because of a precursor. The concept of the Big One is not one that researchers would use. We would tend to look at individual volcanoes. Making predictions about one volcano from another has to be done with very careful thought." Professor Rubin says, "The idea of the Big One is attractive to some reporters. Sometimes media can pick up on the fact here and there and overemphasize it or perhaps change the meaning a bit. We have never seen evidence in the past for the Big One, despite some individually very large eruptions in the past 100,000 years. Over the course of the last century or so, there have been several quite large eruptions, but there really is not any strong evidence that any of these were related to each other. Now, can two high-profile eruptions so close to each other really be a coincidence? Well, they say yes. Tectonic events happen all the time, but fairly obviously the media only covers the ones that are newsworthy. Again, Professor McPherson explains Hawaii is in an iconic location and the type of eruption is photogenic. You only need to see the images of lava flowing through residential streets and destroying homes to understand his point. Meanwhile, Professor Rubin says the eruption in Guatemala, this week was tragic because of the loss of life. Factors have attracted the world's attention to Hawaii and Guatemala. Our experts estimate that between 10 to 20 volcanoes are erupting somewhere in the world at any one time. These events get less coverage for several reasons, usually because they happen in uninhabited areas, including underwater, or because they have not involved any loss of life. That's not to say that the two recent eruptions are geologically uninteresting, though. Professor David Pyle of Oxford University says that both Kilauea in Hawaii and Fuego of Guatemala have experienced dramatic changes in activity recently, with significant shift of magma underneath the Hawaiian volcano and more vigorous activity at the Guatemalan peak. Professor Pyle is very keen to stress that while the eruptions and changes have been unusual, he says this is just part of the unpredictable pattern of behavior at any erupting volcano. There are no wider links between the volcanoes and no expectations of wider consequences for other volcanoes in the Pacific region. And now we will go to the USGS site. Can an eruption at one volcano trigger an eruption at another nearby volcano? And their example says, for example, within a 10-kilometer distance. 10 kilometers is nothing for volcanoes, basically one of its fissures or tubes, you know. Now, this is what the USGS says. There are few historic examples of simultaneous eruptions from volcanoes or vents located within about 10 kilometers of each other, but it's very difficult to determine whether one eruption causes the other. To the extent that these erupting volcanoes or vents have common or overlapping magma reservoirs and hydrothermal systems, magma rising to erupt from one volcano might affect the other volcano's plumbing system and cause some form of unrest, including eruptions. For example, the huge explosive eruption of Nova Rupta vent in Alaska triggered the summit of nearby Mount Katmai volcano to collapse, thereby forming a new caldera, but it did not erupt. For a few of the historic examples of simultaneous eruptions from nearby volcanoes, scientists actually consider the individual volcanoes or vents to be part of a larger volcano complex, consisting of overlapping stratovolcanoes, cinder cones, fissures, vents, and even calderas. In such cases, the erupting vents or volcano are actually part of the same volcano complex. For example, Tavurvur and Vulcan cones that erupted at nearly the same time in September of 1994 are vents located within Rabaul caldera in Papua New Guinea. In such cases, one eruption does not really trigger a nearby vent to erupt. Instead, moving magma leaks to the surface at multiple sites. In contrast to these examples of simultaneous eruptions at volcanoes with overlapping or related magma and hydrothermal systems, two of Earth's most active volcanoes that are located close to each other, Mauna Loa and Kilauea in Hawaii, have separate shallow magma reservoirs that don't seem to affect each other. Even though Kilauea volcano is located to the southeastern flank of Mauna Loa, the summit calderas are only 33 kilometers apart, by the way, and magma rises into both volcanoes, originates from the same mantle hotspot. The chemistry of their magma is nevertheless distinct from each other. The timing of historic eruptions at Mauna Loa and Kilauea strongly suggests that an eruption at one volcano does not cause or trigger an eruption at the other volcano.